need a miracle. I don't know if you've been watching a test match. England might feel that they need a miracle today, and some of us still believe that could happen. Is there something happening in your life where you need God to do something beyond what seems normal or even possible? The Israelites were in such a place as we rejoin the story in Exodus today. And Sarah told this part of the story brilliantly a couple of weeks ago in the church family service. I don't want to merely repeat the things that Sarah said then, but I want us to think about the need for and the nature of miracles in the light of how the account is written in our Bibles. The devastating 10th plague has now happened. The firstborn of all the Egyptians, livestock and children are dead. And the Israelites have finally been allowed to leave. But soon afterwards, Pharaoh changes his mind, and it appears the Israelites are trapped, with the Egyptians on one side coming towards them and the Red Sea on the other. They are in a cul-de-sac with no apparent escape. We read what happens next in chapter 14, 21 to 28. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." And then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. So, Father, thank you for your word, and I pray we will hear you speaking to us today through your word, in the name and for the glory of Jesus. Amen. Jenny wasn't a Christian. She was in her 50s and had been diagnosed with early onset dementia following brain scans. She'd come to our Alpha course, and at the end of the away day, we offered prayer. Jenny asked us to pray for her. And in those moments, everyone in the room sensed that God's Spirit was doing something. She didn't become a Christian, but she phoned me 6 months later. "I'd like you to share with your church that I've been back to the doctors, I've had further scans, and they tell me there is now no trace of the dementia. I don't know what happened on that away day. I can't explain it, but I'm sure that is where I was healed." As far as I know, Jenny hasn't become a Christian even to this day, but she was healed from her early onset dementia. 2 weeks ago, I met with a Burmese pastor called Gin. He has a church in Oxford. Gin supports 17 evangelists working in the villages of Myanmar, Burma, and they meet on Zoom every week to pray and share together. Each week there are reports of people coming to faith and occasionally of miraculous healing. One evangelist recently shared how they visited a family whose pig had just died. There is a picture. It isn't this pig. This isn't the person, but I thought I'd show you a pig in Myanmar. Their livelihood was now under threat because the pig was their source of future income and means of survival. So when the evangelist offered to pray for them and asked them, what would you like to pray for? The family said, we want our pig alive. So the evangelist prayed, and the pig came back to life. A miracle. The family then became Christians themselves. I've never heard of a story like that anywhere else. Age 17, and having been a Christian for just a few months, I travelled to my church in Crewe for a prayer meeting, but managed when I got there to lock my keys in the car. After the meeting, we started to discuss how we could get home and get a spare set of keys, when a friend who had become a Christian even more recently, a man called Mark Dennis, I don't know if Philip and Lynn remember Den, he was known, he challenged us. He said, why don't you pray? Because we hadn't thought about that as a possible solution. So we stood there in the car park and we prayed. We laid hands on the roof of the car. At this point, we burst out laughing because it was so ridiculous. Den got angry with us and he rebuked us. He said, don't you think God is big enough to do this? And he took out his own car key, which was a completely different shape and for a completely different make of car. He held it up and he prayed, living God, show these what you can do. I pray my key will open the door. And over he went to the driver's side, opened the door. He tried it on the other side, it didn't work. I went home and I wept before God because I realized just how much I had doubted him, but also how powerful and awesome God is. Do we need a miracle? When is a miracle a miracle? When is it just coincidence? Does it really matter whether it's coincidence? Because we can see God's hand at work in the coincidence. There are different explanations within this story. 9-year-old Joey was asked by his mother what he'd learned in Sunday school that day. Well, Mum, our teacher told us how God sent Moses behind the enemy lines on a rescue mission to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. When he got to the Red Sea, he had his engineers build a pontoon bridge, and all the people walked across safely. He used his walkie-talkie to radio headquarters and call in an airstrike. They sent in bombers to blow up the bridge, and all the Israelites were saved. Now, Joey, is that really what your teacher taught you? His mother asked. Well, no, Mum, but if I told it the way the teacher did, you would never believe it. What is fascinating, if you look closely at our text this morning, is a contrast between certain verses which explain this parting of the Red Sea. Some verses emphasize the supernatural occurrence. Let me read some to you. Verse 22, the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Then verses 28 and 29, it says, the water flowed back, covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of the Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. And it says in the next chapter, in chapter 15, verse 8, where there's a hymn of praise for what's happened. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The surging waters stood up like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. You see, these verses, it is a miracle. There's walls of water either side, and we get some great art around this if you have a look. Something happens here for which there is no scientific explanation. And then some of the verses hint that, well, maybe there were actual natural causes at work here. Verse 21 says, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided. And verse 24 and 25, during the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from a pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army, threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. It's explaining here why the Egyptians got stuck. And the emphasis on these verses is less on miracle and supernatural, but more on irony. The sea is divided by a strong wind, And we could speculate, but maybe the Israelites were at a place where there was a ridge, and actually they were able to walk across, and they traveled on foot. But once the Egyptians came with their heavier chariots, then they got into trouble. And the irony here would be that the chariots for the Egyptians were what made them a great nation. It was because they had chariots that they had a military advantage over every other nation around them. And they encounter wheel trouble. They really are in trouble. I had to say that line. The old joke, isn't it? Where's he been? I've been to Spain. Where's he really been? I've really been to Spain. They encounter wheel trouble here. The very thing that makes them superior in battles is their downfall. God undermines their power and their might because their chariots get stuck here in the mud. And they don't think about anything else but getting their chariots. They want their chariots. And so as they focus on their wheels of their chariots, they're thrown into confusion. And it actually says that they run into the sea. They head off into the sea. They get confused. The waters come back in, and they get confused, and they are drowned. But those verses are less about the supernatural occurrence here and more about the irony that the thing that the Egyptian army, the power of the Egyptian army, the chariot, is actually confounded by God's doing as they get stuck because of their chariots. Now, does it matter whether we focus on the supernatural or the natural? It doesn't, because actually God is at work in and through this, however God is working. God is organizing and orchestrating what happens here to bring about the deliverance of his people. And if we look at the natural explanation, we see no less of God's hand on these events. They've come out of Egypt. It tells us they're led by this pillar of cloud by day and pillar of fire at night, and they're moved around. They're not taken on the most direct route. Commentator F.B. Mayer estimates that they could have got to the Promised Land in 10 days if they'd have gone the direct route, but they're not taken through Philistine land because it says they would have been discouraged by that. Instead, God takes them around this strange route, this unusual route that takes them through the desert and brings them to the Red Sea. When they arrive at the Red Sea, they turn back, and they end up at this place called Pi Hahiroth, and it's we don't know where these places are anymore. It's been lost, and people haven't yet discovered with any confidence where these places are, but they have to wait there, and then they see the Egyptians coming to them. And as Moses stretches out his hand, the east wind blows and the sea separates. Now, did God send this wind separately? Because Moses raised his hand, does God then initiate a wind that wasn't going to happen? Or does Moses raise his hand because God already has that wind blowing, but actually Moses is prompted to raise his hand to see that God is in all of this in a natural way? We don't know. It doesn't matter. And the timing of their arrival, including the additional time because of their detour, it's just at that point that the wind blows. And they're at a place, at just a point where they can cross through safely. It's no less the work of God if we look at the natural side. It's no less miraculous. It is no less God's deliverance. So we don't need to worry about how God does it and whether there is a natural or supernatural explanation. God doesn't need to suspend the laws of nature to bring about miraculous deliverance. He can do, but he doesn't need to. God is at work in everything in our lives. He's at work in the details. He's at work through hospitals. When we pray for healing, he can work through hospitals, he can work through the natural understanding, and he can work in the miraculous. And in our text, actually what we see is that God's supernatural and his everyday events are all viewed as God being at work. There's an integrated understanding that God is at work in and through everything. And as Christians, we need to have a similar understanding. We don't say that just because it's not a miracle, God isn't working. Actually, God is at work in every detail of every moment of our lives. And as we look to him, we can be led by his Spirit as the Israelites were led by the cloud, to be in the right place at the right time for what God is doing. If the Israelites hadn't followed the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire at night, they wouldn't have been where they needed to be at the time they needed to be there. God works through the natural and the supernatural to bring about his purposes. Gladys Aylward was a missionary to China in the 1930s. She was well respected by the locals, taking in orphans and adopting several herself, intervening in a volatile prison riot and advocating prison reform, risking her life many times to help those in need. In 1938, the region was invaded by Japanese forces, and Aylward led more than 100 orphans to safety over the mountains, despite being wounded and sick, personally caring for them, and many of those orphans became Christians. In their book, The Hidden Price of Greatness, Ray Besson and Ronalda Mack Hunsicker tell what happened. They write this: during Gladys's harrowing journey out of war-torn Yangcheng, she grappled with despair as never before. After passing a sleepless night, she faced the morning with no hope of reaching safety. A 13-year-old girl in the group reminded her of their much-loved story of Moses and the Israelites crossing the Red Sea. "But I'm not Moses," Gladys cried out in desperation. "Of course you aren't," the 13-year-old girl said, "but God is still God." Are you in need of a miracle? Is there a situation in your life where you need God to act and do something beyond what seems possible? God is still God. The God who parts the seas is still the God who is at work in our lives today. He's at work when we can't see him. He's at work when we don't understand what he's doing. He's at work in the natural as well as the supernatural. Come to him and ask him, because he is still God. He will be with you in your situation as you look to him. As you look to him. As you allow your sight, as the Israelites followed the cloud, as you look to him, he will lead you to where he needs to lead you, where you need to be. He will guide you, and he will bring about the deliverance that you need. I'm not saying that everything will be rosy. God doesn't promise us that. But I'm saying that God is in control of all the detail of our lives as we look to him. There might not be a miracle that happens, but God still will work his purposes out through the natural thing. But there might be a miracle, like the key, like Jenny's healing from early onset dementia, like the resuscitated pig, because God is perfectly capable of working his purposes out as we put our faith in him. God is still God.